the security dialogue.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We welcome you once again to the Security Dialogue Show on Muslim Television and Media International. Previous days, we've had the opportunity to talk about a lot of issues around terrorism. We've looked at peace building. Just last week, we looked at domestic violence and how it fits into the whole security architecture and how we can model the community for us to have a very peaceful environment. Today, we are going to have another wonderful topic and a very wonderful person to help us do the discussion. You all bear with me that when you look around, the issue of terrorism and human rights are becoming a broader phenomenon, not just legal problems, even though there are some intertwined. And the legal perspective is surely not the only avenue relevant to the analysis of their role in contemporary human relations or international relations. But more so, human rights are commonly understood to encompass those rights to which all persons are entitled without discrimination by the mere fact of being a human being. And that is what we are going to look at. So today we are looking at terrorism, we are looking at human rights and legal matters. And to help me to do this, I have in the studio lawyer Justice Abdullahi, who is a private legal practitioner and a lecturer at the University of Professional Studies, what we normally call UPSA. Lawyer, you are welcome to the studios of MTA.
Indeed, thank you so much.
We are in the business, or we are in the role of projecting Islam, and Islam is the way forward. Of course, the program is just towards ensuring peace and security all over the world, and this is in follow-up to Khilafat, as our supreme head himself has been an advocate when it comes to peace. The followers cannot go without that, and that is why we are here today. You can also follow us on our various handles, so you can catch MTA live on the Facebook. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and other YouTube as well. We are here so that you can get the quality of information that we are sharing here with you. And so today, like I said, we are looking at issues of terrorism, human rights, and then legal matters. Counsel, yes. Of course, when it comes to the interpretation of what stands to be right or what stands not to be right, we normally tend to, as it is, we call them learned colleagues. And so we tend to you for such interpretation. And that is why we have, of course, the court systems and all of that for us to be able to get a better understanding of what we are doing as a people. And my first, but I want to take your initial issue or comment when it comes to issues of terrorism around. I mean, what do you see how?
It's a difficult subject area. It comes along with all the bigotry that you can ever think of. It's difficult today to talk of terrorism without escaping the mention of Islam. It's difficult to talk about terrorism without mentioning the Arabian world, and it's more or less today. Terrorism is another version or another name for Islamic fundamentalism. Hitherto, freedom fighters were the ones who were called terrorists. You wouldn't find any religious groupings being categorically described as terrorist. We moved on from the days of political freedom fighters. And even though we all know that some of the issues that we are confronted with today are still in relation to politics and other economic factors, somehow for whatever reason, whether coincidentally or otherwise, when the same thing is done by a person with Islamic background or Arabian background, whether he's a Christian but an Arab, he will be automatically declared a terrorist. And it makes it difficult for every Muslim, wherever you are in the world, to manifest your religion the way you would have wished to do. It makes it difficult for you to be bold and call yourself a Muslim out there in the world, particularly when you are with a Westerner or when you are in the West in particular, Europe and America. And because terrorism has now become synonymous to the religion of God. And so that's how difficult things have become.
Now, dovetailing into that, and then you being a legal practitioner, I want to understand how the linkage to terrorism, human rights, legal issues, we're looking at the root causes and all of that. So give us that legal perspective, and then what constitutes terrorism at what point in time? Because you've just mentioned freedom fighters. So that if a group of people today feels that their basic human rights are being infringed upon, and then they have the right to stand up to that, and then we now categorize those people, or we see them to be a group of terrorist persons. What will be the legal implications? What will be the human rights issues in there, so that we can now understand and be able to distinguish between what we call nationalism and then maybe the act of violent extremism and then terrorism?
Now, to make it simple, if you want to define what terrorism is about, it's simply this: that every time a person uses violence means against others, whether mass of people or individuals, it would amount to terrorism.
Okay.
So if you use terror, if you want to be simple about it, if you use terror or violence, of course, unlawfully against other persons, the person doing that could be called a terrorist, and the act is terrorism. Now, over the years, as I said earlier, in fact, the earliest portions of, reminiscence of terrorism, possibly for most recent years, will be South Africa, Nelson Mandela, the earliest, we can think of. Of course, it goes further, right from the days of the Americas taking their independence from Britain. If you remember, when the Americans were fighting for their independence, the Americans were termed as terrorists. But they were actually the earliest terrorists in the world.
Wow.
When they were taking their independence from the British, because they had to use unlawful violence in order to be able to obtain their independence that they hardly fought for. And within the same America, if you see how the Americans themselves, the Europeans in particular, the Europeans who moved to America, particularly the British, and how they literally massacred the Native Americans, that is or was an act of terrorism. They literally wiped out a whole ethnic grouping from the surface of the world. Today, we have less than 400,000 or so, less than 1 million of the Native Americans in the United States. And the barbaric nature with which these people were killed in open were conducts that is not completely different from the acts of terrorism. But the earliest portions that historians will tell you about terrorism would always be from the days, the 1700s, when the Americans were taking their independence from Britain. And so, because they had to use violence means in order to be able to obtain what they so much desired. Remember, this was political, but it was still terrorist. They used terrorism or the means of terror in order to be able to get what they wanted. It was a similar thing that happened in South Africa when the apartheid system was operating, and Nelson Mandela and his group of freedom fighters had to adopt violence means with which to get their political freedom that they needed. And sometimes, undesirable as it may be, they had to use guns and explosives and other means. Now, once these things happen, automatically there would be casualties regrettable casualties. Some people may call it collateral damage for those of you in this field.
Yeah.
But no human being can be collateral. And so it's very difficult for you to call a fellow human being as being a collateral. But unfortunately, this happens. If it's your direct family, then you can understand that there's no collateral. Yeah. It's as painful as you can ever think of. But as I can say, because it's not you, because you are not directly affected, sometimes you think it's not painful. Yeah. It doesn't hurt. So, yes, so this is how terrorism comments. Now, you asked directly how terrorism interfaces with human rights. Yeah. Now, each time acts of terror are occasioned, the fundamental rights of others are breached. Now, the fundamental rights of other people come in the form of, come in two forms. Okay. One granted by the Almighty Allah at the time of your birth or creation. Okay. Then the second one is an acquired right. Okay. And usually that is a constitutionally given. Okay. It's a legally given right. Now, sometimes both rights are lost. Okay. Sometimes both rights are breached, maybe not lost. Now, how are they? The ones that you are giving, it comes along with you as human. Okay. Was given to you by God, and that is your right to life in particular. Okay. You have a right to life. Okay. Everyone has a right to life. Okay. And this is reinforced in our case by our Constitution, that everyone has a right to life. And this can only be taken away under specified circumstances. So now, if you want to define terror by way of our constitutional provisions, then this is how. Anytime you take away a person's life unlawfully through violence means, you would have committed an act of terror. Okay. And how does it happen? Because Constitution provides that the only circumstances under which you can take someone else's life is where it's under an execution of a judgment. Okay. So, i.e., where a court of competent jurisdiction has pronounced the person guilty and sentenced the person to death. Okay. Then in such a case, you can take that person's life. Okay. But however, it must be the case that the one taking the life is the one entrusted with authority to take the life. Okay. i.e., if person A has been sentenced to death, and person B is the authorized person to execute the judgment, and person C kills the same person who has been sentenced to death, A, C will be guilty of murder. Okay. Okay. That will be unlawful. Because it's unlawful. Okay. He was going to die anyway. Yeah. He was going to be killed. Okay. But the killing ought to have been done by the state and not you as an individual. So if you poison the same person who was going to be killed, maybe 30 minutes time, he was going to be killed in 30 minutes, but you poison him, you would also be, most likely, be guilty of murder. That may not be terror, but even though you might have used violent means to execute it. So what that tells you is that there's a thin line between the ordinary killing and terror. Okay. So that thin line would usually come into, to be able to distinguish between the two, you are likely to find the numbers that are killed would be an issue naturally. Okay. And the means of killing would also be an issue. Okay. And so, for instance, if person A has a gun on a rooftop and shooting people indiscriminately, that person is likely to be termed as a terrorist. Okay. Assuming he even kills one person, he will still be considered as a terrorist. But person A, B, who may be maybe in your domestic setting, probably stabs another one, is likely to be called a murderer. Okay. And not a terrorist. Okay. Okay. But that same person who used a knife to stab a colleague in the domestic setting, assuming he does the same thing maybe in an office setting and probably succeed in stabbing 2-3 people, he'll be called a terrorist. But sometimes it's not just the killing. Okay. Other factors also come in, of course, naturally. Okay. The motive. Okay. Okay. Yeah. The motive of the killing.
I was going to go to that. Yeah.
So the motive would also inform us as to whether it's a terror or an ordinary killing. Okay. So usually the motive it becomes a religious motive most of the times. If it is a religious motive, automatically you'll be considered as a terrorist. If it's a political motive, most likely you'll be considered as a terrorist. Any other motive, you are likely to be considered simply a murderer or maybe a mentally deranged person if you're a white man.
Okay, thank you very much on that. I think you've helped me in my next line, but I still want some clarity, even though you've mentioned the fact that the impact when it comes to issues of killing, for instance, or the violent nature of whatever activity that may go on will depend. But looking at terrorism and then let's say domestic criminal law, I mean, and when it comes to those criminality like assault, manslaughter, malicious, wounding, murder, property destruction, and all of that, how do we then distinguish terrorism from this ordinary, let me put it there, ordinary crimes of everyday happening?
So clearly, that was a trajectory that I was going.
Okay.
So as I was explaining earlier, your motive in doing that will determine how this kind of killing is classified.
Okay.
So as I said earlier, if between you and between person A and person B, with due apologies, it turns out that perhaps there was a disagreement over some money payment, which is always the case, or maybe one was chasing the other's wife, and then as a result, during an ensuing battle, the other strikes one, and maybe he falls, his head maybe crashes over maybe an object and dies. Now this is death, but no one would classify this as terrorism because it's the motive that at the end of the day will determine whether or not to classify it as terrorism. Okay. But the same person, for instance, the same people, the same two people, A and B, if the same person had killed this person and the next minute he uploads on social media that I finished him, can you imagine that bigot? He was calling Muslims terrorists and I finished him. You are likely to find this person who is accusing the other of calling others bigots and stuff, and for which reason he killed him. That person is likely to be called a terrorist. And the reason is not because of the posting, but it's because of the entire circumstances surrounding it. The circumstances, the motives, and other surrounding factors, all put together, are likely to be considered, to be used to be considered as the basis in determining whether or not the person is a terrorist.
So in other words, when it comes to the legal implications of this, it means that they will look at, of course, they will look at the motives and then probably put you on a certain trial.
Naturally.
If it is murder, then you are now...
Absolutely.
But...
and that's very important that you raise that, because if it is an ordinary murder, depending on the circumstances, if it's an ordinary murder, you'll be charged on indictment, of course. You go through the ordinary means of indictment trial. You go to a district court, which will determine whether or not indeed you committed the offense, and then you are referred to the higher court, and where they would empanel jurors and other persons to determine, and then when you are found guilty, of course, sentenced either to death or life imprisonment. Now, usually, if it is terrorism, it doesn't go that fast. If it is terrorism, because of the circumstances in particular, the chances are that even trial could take a number of years. Even though in Ghana we do not have laws specifically on terrorism. We do not, unlike other countries like UK and then US, they have terrorism acts specifically designed to take care of terrorists. Here we don't have anything like that. And so we operate with our criminal system, criminal jurisprudence. And so when you commit any offense in that area, you'll be treated usually in accordance with this. Otherwise, but the factual issues that I was going to discuss, let me talk about that quickly, is that once we get a sense of the offense being a terrorist act, even if nobody dies, remember, terrorism is not necessarily by killing someone. Persons may not die, but you still be considered terrorist. And so, so when it happens that way, because terrorism has followers and sometimes sympathizers, and because of the political nature or sometimes economic nature or sometimes the religious nature, there are masses of persons who are likely to identify with this individual if they are not already in a group. You're likely to find people who identify with this person. And so it is treated with that sense of caution, just so you get to the root of it. Because you can imprison one individual, possibly sentence him to death, but the next day you find 10 of his likes, 10 of his kind coming up. The next day you may find 100 of its kind springing up all over
Okay.
because of the nature of it. So treating acts of terrorism are treated not only with the level of expertise that it desires, but it also is treated with that level of caution, just so that you do not end up, in your bid to fight it, end up creating more.
Understand. So that will take me to my next question. When we look at maybe countermeasures as far as the rights of every individual is concerned, and then we're looking at the legal aspect. What should be the countermeasures in mitigating this phenomena?
And that question also, of course, automatically brings in the issue of the human rights. So the state has the biggest role to play. The state is indeed the biggest stakeholder here.
Okay.
And as much as possible, the first thing that I consider the most important in the fight against terrorism would always be the interface of the state as against minority groupings.
Okay.
Minority groupings.
Okay.
Because when people feel disadvantaged, when people feel unfairly treated, when people feel bitter, that is what gives birth, most instances, to terrorism. Because when people, particularly when they have no means of advancing their grievances.
So will I be right in that point to seek, for instance, your counsel as a lawyer, because then I feel that as a minority, this is how I have been dealt with, or these are the brutality that have been met with me. And in my attempt to fight back, I am now seen as a terrorist. Do I have the right to seek legal counsel?
Most of the times, I would say, well, without any statistics, I wouldn't say that, but a lot of instances, what you would find is that minority groupings feel that they have no means of addressing their grievances.
Okay.
Or some instances, they believe that they've exhausted or they've done all that they could do to get their issues addressed, and it doesn't get addressed. And so the first thing is to get attention onto themselves.
Okay.
You have to draw attention onto themselves. And without being an expert in this area, common sense will tell you that the moment the person, for instance, what they may see as a small, maybe, attempt to get attention, maybe to plant an explosive in a harmless environment, sometimes it gets overboard because everybody comes to this environment with a different motive. So maybe the originator may have a very, very simple ideas that, let's just explode that container behind our house. And automatically the authorities would realize that we have something. Or sometimes, like others do, they will just start writing on billboards and writing all over the society that or the community they live in, writing their grievances and to draw their attention. But this may be a civilized way of doing it. But it is not everybody who has that mentality, that idea that a civilized way of doing things would get the necessary response. And sometimes actually it doesn't, sometimes. But if that bus with almost no one inside gets exploded, or that filling station, God forbid this happening, with no human presence, maybe at midnight where nobody is there, they put it on fire. Naturally, attention of the society will be drawn. Maybe the next day they put out there on TV, and then claiming responsibility for that. Then suddenly everybody's attention is drawn to them. This may be a harmless way of drawing attention, but unfortunately, sometimes you cannot predict when you shoot a gun who becomes a victim of the bullet. Sometimes you can just not predict. You think you are giving a warning shot, but you don't know who is also jumping from the sky.
So it makes it a very complex situation.
It's
when
actually the reason why we shouldn't even use terrorism as a means of addressing our issues. There must always be civilized way in addressing issues. There is always a civilized way. Sometimes there are no legal means of doing it. That is true. But which is why there's always other means. Demonstrations, for instance. Demonstrations are the best tools. Press conferences.
Counsel, Thank you very much. We'll come to conclude on this very one. Viewers, all too soon, the very first part of this very discussion has just come to an end. We thank you for being with us. We are going to bring you the concluding part of this discussion on terrorism, human rights, and legal matters. And like from what Council said, there's a very thin line between terrorism and human rights because at the earlier days, those who were the nationalists who were celebrated for liberating their countries or communities from adversity were seen as people who love their nations. But today, same category of persons are seen as terrorists. And that is what we, so we want to see the line of human rights and then legal issues. And lawyer has made us aware that when it comes to Ghana, though we do not have that system to adjudicate when it comes to issues of terrorism. However, the motive behind every act will determine whether it becomes an issue of a normal crime or that full-blown act of terrorism. Like I indicated, we're going to bring the concluding part. So I have had here in the studio Justice Abdullahi, who is a legal practitioner, private legal practitioner, a lecturer with University of Professional Studies, who has helped me to do this. And we are going to come back with the concluding part. My name is Sadiq Edichum. Stay here, stay tuned. This is the Security Dialogue.